Hi, everyone. We're so grateful you're joining us this morning. I'm Steve Riley, investigative reporter with The Messenger, and a member of the National Press Club serving on its press freedom team and its board of governors. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the National Press Club Journalism Institute and the National Press Club's press freedom team. As the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club, the Institute powers journalism in the public interest. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping notes. We have a live transcription, closed captioning option available during this program. If you are joining us on a desktop or laptop computer, you can enable this at any time by finding the CC Live Transcription button in the navigation menu. Click the Show Subtitle button and closed captioning will start. You can also disable this at any point by clicking Hide Subtitle. We will be recording this program and a link to the video will be emailed to you, so if you miss something, don't worry, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. Highlights from the program will also appear on our website and in the newsletter with the video. And if you aren't already receiving the Institute's daily newsletter for journalists, you can subscribe now. This program is designed as a conversation, and we hope you'll join in with comments and questions as we go along. Please share questions anytime in the Q&A area. We will be monitoring them and responding later in the program. And with that, let's begin. When we think about threats to journalists, our first instinct is sometimes to look outside the borders of the United States. There were 363 journalists detained around the world in connection with their work at the end of 2022, a 30-year high according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. But it's also important to recognize and confront the fact that journalists in the United States face constant threats, often from government authorities, for their news gathering activities. Journalists face harassment, threats, intimidation, physical hostilities, and even detentions and arrests simply for doing their jobs of asking questions and documenting newsworthy events. This can occur whether you're working for a large media company or a smaller local news organization. And to talk about these threats and share their firsthand experiences, I'm honored and delighted to introduce our four panelists today. We have with us Matilda Bliss and Veronica Coit, two journalists with the Asheville Blade, a citizen journalism publication, who were arrested in 2021 on trespassing charges while documenting a sweep of a homeless camp. Recently released body cam footage indicates they were targeted due to their news gathering activities. Their case is currently in appeal to a jury trial. Also joining us is Dion Rabowen, a Wall Street Journal reporter who was conducting routine person-on-the-street interviews outside of the bank in Phoenix when police detained him. The mayor eventually personally apologized for his mistreatment. Also joining us is Seth Stern, Director of Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which oversees the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. And Seth, I'd like to start with you to see if you can help put this conversation in context. What do we know about press freedom threats in the United States?
Well, first of all, Steve, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for everyone for being here. This is an important conversation, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So to speak about arrests in particular, you mentioned arrests were up worldwide. In the US, they're actually down in 2022. There were 15 last year. In 2021, there were over 50, almost 150 in 2020, but I wouldn't read much into that. The trend correlates with there being fewer protests. About 2/3 of the arrests that happen are at protests. And when there were an increased number of protests, for example, after the decision overturning Roe versus Wade, we saw more arrests. That's when about half of last year's arrests happened. I haven't seen any indication that police departments have changed their policies or that arrests won't spike again next time there's substantial civil unrest. And I would note that each arrest, even when they're down, is its own story and significant in its own right. For example, one journalist arrested last year, Derek Myers in Ohio, he was charged with wiretapping because his source allegedly made an illegal recording. But the Supreme Court has ruled that journalists aren't responsible for illegal things their sources might do. That's a precedent the federal government also ignores when it prosecutes Julian Assange. Another trend that's relevant to today's conversation would be arrests during evictions of unhoused people. Last year, prosecutors dropped a similar case against an Oregon journalist, April Ehrlich, just before that case was set for trial. And we're seeing police inventing new ways to go after reporters that we hadn't even thought of. Matilda and Veronica will talk about their recent learning that police banned them from city parks for a year with no judicial review. I don't know that we've seen that before. We just had a case in Arizona a couple of weeks ago where a judge granted a restraining order against a journalist at the behest of a politician that the journalist was investigating. The journalist was knocking at the politician's door to find out whether she violated residency requirements, routine stuff. We had no prior record of that happening. So although there are fewer journalists arrested last year, it's not time to let our guard down by any means. And the tracker monitors various categories of press freedom violations aside from arrests. If you'd like me to talk about some of those, I'm happy to do so, but I don't want to take up too much time.
If you could quickly talk about some of the broader threats as well. I know there are different interactions with law enforcement that are concerning outside of what you just talked about. What are you seeing more broadly?
Well, we also track equipment searches and equipment seizures. That's a real problem, and not to get too ahead of the conversation, but it's something that's relevant to Matilda and Veronica's case, as I'm sure they'll talk about. And then there are violence against journalists, not only by police and law enforcement, but by regular people, assaults of journalists for doing their job, which is just driven by the increased anti-press rhetoric that we've seen in this country as of late. And then when journalists get into court, there are entirely new categories of problems they face. There are gag orders and prior restraints, which the Supreme Court has held are unconstitutional, even in cases like the Pentagon Papers, where the government claimed a national security risk. You'd think judges would know that they can't gag the press, but they still continue to try. So we monitor that. And even more commonly, judges, particularly in high-profile cases, gag the attorneys, the witnesses, the litigants, the law enforcement agencies, so that without directly restraining the press, they're preventing the press from doing its job, from communicating with sources. And in many cases, that's also unconstitutional. And then we've got, subpoenas to journalists, trying to force them by threat of law to burn or disclose their sources or their news gathering material. 49 states recognize some kind of reporter's privilege. The strength of those privileges vary from state to state, but prosecutors and defense lawyers too still try all the time to intimidate reporters into, as I said, burning their sources. Unfortunately, there's no reporter's privilege at the federal level. The Department of Justice did announce a policy last year of no longer compelling journalists to reveal their sources, but the DOJ is just one of many government agencies, and policies and regulations can easily be repealed by future administrations. And, with some of the people who are running or likely to run for president, it's a pretty safe bet that they wouldn't allow that policy to stand. So we advocate for Congress to pass the Press Act, which would be a very strong shield law at the federal level. It has bipartisan support. It passed the House unanimously last year. It'll probably be reintroduced in pretty soon this year, and we're optimistic because actually there's bipartisan support not only among the rank and file, but among leadership on the House and Senate Judiciary Committees for shield bills and for reporters' privileges.
Thank you, Seth. Certainly a disturbing landscape. And maybe if we could go to Dion, if you could share your story. Obviously, we're tracking the numbers here, but each individual story tells us a lot about the status of press freedom in the United States. You were doing the most routine type of news gathering, doing person on the street interviews. Every reporter has done those. You were doing your job, and could you talk about what happened at that bank on that day?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me as well. I was, like you said, outside of a Chase Bank branch in Phoenix. I was there over the holidays visiting with some family. And I decided to go to this branch because I was doing a story about why customers had chosen to stick with some of the big banks, your JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, et cetera, versus moving into some of these higher yield savings accounts and getting paid more for their savings than they could. So I figure, let's go out to these banks and actually talk to some of their customers. And, I was just standing outside the Chase Bank branch. I thought I was on a public sidewalk, just kind of, outside of the way of the entrance. Someone from the bank came out, asked kind of what I was doing, what was happening. I let them know I was a reporter, that I was there working on a story. They went back inside the bank branch, told me they were going to call someone. A little while later, the police showed up, or one officer showed up, and went inside. When he came back outside, he came up to me, told me that the bank wanted me trespassed. I kind of inquired with him about what that meant. He said, they want me removed from the property, they want me gone. I said, okay, if they want me to leave, I can leave. I'm willing to, go away. He informed me that I couldn't leave because I was trespassing. I asked him, we kind of went back and forth. I'm like, if I'm trespassing, then I can leave and then I won't be trespassing anymore. And he said that basically once I had trespassed, I was going to be detained for trespassing and wouldn't be allowed to leave. So he physically prevented me from leaving. Fortunately, there was a young woman who had come outside the bank who saw the interaction, who, in her words, had a sense that something wasn't going right, started recording the interaction. The cop pretty quickly after that put me in cuffs, took me to his car. I was detained for probably about 15 minutes just in the back of that car. Never really understood and still haven't gotten a real good explanation for why that happened. But we were told, I reported that to my organization, the Wall Street Journal, and they reached out to Phoenix Police as well as to Chase Bank. There's been a pretty big deal made of the story, I think, just because people have seen the video and they see how kind of ludicrous it is that an officer would take the time to cuff a reporter who's standing outside doing his job, put him in the back of a police car. Phoenix Police really hasn't answered our repeated requests for an explanation. They say they've got an investigation ongoing, even though I was told personally that they closed the investigation and found no wrongdoing. So we're really just kind of in a holding pattern. Our former editor-in-chief, Matt Murray, wrote a letter. He's followed up a couple times seeking out information, trying to find out what's going on, why this happened, and we really haven't been given any information about it. I think kind of maybe in a bit of a difference to what we're seeing in the case of Matilda and Veronica, this is, I think, certainly an abuse of power, but one that just, as a Black man, wasn't unfamiliar to me in terms of dealing with the police. I think a lot of times whenever we interact with police, especially in the US, there is a genuine fear for our lives and a fear that, the interaction could end with us, if not in a jail somewhere, whether we've done anything wrong or not, dead. Maybe that's it. So this was just another one of those interactions. And fortunately, I really am very thankful for the woman who recorded, and this had a better ending than it could have been. But I think it definitely was a reminder of some of the dangers of just being outside and dealing with police.
And certainly, if anyone watching hasn't seen the video yet, it's worth seeing Dion's experience on this video that was luckily filmed. Have you received any responses from the bank involved and from the city of Phoenix outside of the police department? Have they been in contact with you about anything they've done to address what happened?
Yeah, actually, as I said, our editor-in-chief sent some messages to folks at Chase. I got a call a couple days after that from Chase's head of communications. He apologized for what happened, said that, that wasn't and shouldn't have been the policy, and that they were starting up some training courses for folks at that branch to make sure that they understood that calling the police on someone who's a reporter who's outside doing their job isn't the way that they want these things handled. I've attempted to speak with the manager at the branch, but haven't been able to do that. But yeah, that definitely happened. And then the mayor of Phoenix actually sent me an email personally apologizing, saying that this wasn't how they thought things should be handled, how the way that the police should be interacting with reporters or with people in general in these kinds of situations. So that's been a positive. I've also spoken with the Justice Department because the Phoenix Police Department is under investigation currently, was prior to this, for the way that they've handled protesters, reporters, journalists. really just their general response to the public for a little while now. And the Justice Department, I think, is expected to be wrapping up that investigation pretty soon. So yeah, there's been a response basically from everyone except for the police, who still have not responded to us in any way, despite our repeated requests for information.
And finally, I'm wondering how this has affected you. I mean, you were just doing your job in the first place, and has this been? What is it like to go through something like this? Does it distract from your work? Has it been a difficult process to kind of go through the aftermath of this?
Yeah, it's been difficult in the sense that there obviously, once the story came out, right? The story came out in January after reports came out about the letter from our editor-in-chief, and various iterations or instances have come out since, and there was a lot of media attention, a lot of requests for interviews. I haven't wanted to do a lot of interviews because I spoke with a reporter in Phoenix, really laid the entire story out. In my mind, there wasn't a lot to say after that. Because there wasn't any new information. And, as a reporter, I think just like a lot of us, I don't like to make myself the story. So I've, really not wanted to do a lot of interviews or talk a whole lot about it. I think in this case, especially right now, when we've got one of WSJ's reporters, Evan Gershkovich, who's, locked up in a Russian prison right now, essentially for doing his job as a reporter. I did think it was important to kind of bring a spotlight to that and talk about that a little bit, but also just to talk about, some of the different ways that the profession is being encroached upon by folks. So I would say, I think the intent was more to intimidate me as a human than as a journalist. Like I said, as a Black man, this isn't unusual. I actually, after the reports came out, I sent out some tweets detailing all of the negative experiences that I've had with police. I think it was about 50 tweets long, just because most of my experiences with police, and they've almost all been outside of the job, have all been negative to some degree. And it's, it really, I think, is more reminiscent of the issue that one has as a Black man trying to exist in the country, whether it's doing your job or driving your car or walking down the street. A lot of times, you are suspicious in the eyes of law enforcement, and they can take varying degrees of action to invoke themselves into your life because of that suspicion.
Well, we very much appreciate you sharing your story with us here today, and I'd like to come back to a couple parts of the aftermath of what you have gone through. But I'd also like to hear Matilda and Veronica. You were doing, you work for a different publication, a different sort. It's a community news organization rather than a large national publication, but it was still a situation where you were doing routine news gathering, and you were having this interaction with police, and your prosecution continues to this day. Could you kind of talk about the news gathering you were involved in, and what transpired on Christmas Day 2021?
Sorry, it's muted. Sure. Thanks, Steve. So a little bit about our publication. Chances are you haven't heard about it. We're a pretty small reader-supported publication. We have been around since 2014 was when our founder and editor started the Blade. So to give some context, we're a proudly leftist publication. We don't try to dance around that. We've been openly critical of city officials and the police department. So going into that Christmas, we had been covering other events in Aston Park. It's on the corner of downtown Asheville, and is really in proximity to a lot of social services that homeless people use here. And so there was an art party that was happening the Sunday before Christmas, so that was the 19th, and we were able to cover some of that. And one thing that we noticed that was coming up was that like there were tents set up, like in addition to it being like an art party. So people were using that as a place to sleep and like be warm. The city was not providing sufficient code purple shelter, so a lot of houseless people were looking for somewhere safe. And so one of the conversations that had happened that day was that the police were saying that even though they had a standard operating procedure of giving camps 7 days to move before being evicted, they were in the process of changing that, and that the new policy that they were going to put into place at a later date was going to allow them to clear this camp now, which is just absurd. And so we were tracking that. We were tracking, some of the, like, there was a lot of anti-gentrification. So people leave that first night, on the 19th, and they come back the next night. And there's a lot of anti-gentrification signs. There's art, there's art in a park. People are gathering and sharing food, playing music, enjoying each other's company. And each night, there's people trying to set up community. And each night you have the police telling them to leave, against their standard operating procedure, of course. And so, this goes on for a few days, and we're able to be there every night. This is one of the core issues to Asheville right now, one of the most, hotly debated issues, and many other publications were there through the week. So, even on Christmas Day, we weren't the only publication that was in Aston Park. Just like another publication in the Asheville Free Press, we were informed that people would be gathering, and so we were there to track it, just like we had done other nights. Not much happened. I think that I got there around 4 or 5, and not much was happening. I mean, people were, like other nights, just gathering and eating food and sharing time with each other. Not really any like conflict really to speak of either. People were pretty much getting along, and like there was a lot of cheer, like Christmas cheer, I guess, happening in this camp. So then there were tents set up, we're such a small publication that pretty much, I think every single one of us has to have like other sources of income. So I actually needed to go and get a corgi out for her last potty break of the night. So that was from like 9 to 9:30. And I come back to Aston Park, and by that point, the police had shown up and told them that, they needed to leave, and if they didn't leave, they would be they could be arrested for trespassing. And so we're like, wow. So this is a hotly debated issue. We're here in the park. We've been here. We're covering this. We're trying to see, one, if the Asheville Police Department standard operating procedure is something they take seriously in any regard. And two, whether they would actually evict a camp on Christmas, which is enormous news, obviously. So I'm able to actually capture an image of the police coming up the hill, because Aston is on a hill. So there was really only one place that we could be, considering especially that the tents themselves were at the crest of the hill. And so we're hearing police tell us that that we're trespassing, that that it's nice that we're pressed, but we still need to leave. And so Veronica and I are getting images. I mean, some of these images you might have seen, which would have been impossible for us to leave, would have been impossible for us to capture if we left exactly at park closing. Anyway, so we're just like, I was audio recording, Veronica was videotaping, getting pictures, and come to find out later on that in body cam footage, we were actually targeted first because we were gathering news, you know, because they were videotaping was actually their words. So it got to be around 10:30 when Veronica was suddenly arrested. Veronica, do you want to talk about when you came to the park and how that happened?
Yeah, I can pick up. So like Matilda said, this had been going on for a week. I'd been there other nights, but it was Christmas, so I was staying home with my family. And as my night was starting to wind down, I decided to get a plate together and take it to Matilda out there. And within a few minutes, I looked down the hill and there's just 10 cop cars all of a sudden. And I looked at Matilda and I knew I couldn't leave her alone. Really, more of us needed to be there. It's a large top of the hill area, and I knew we didn't want to miss anything because it struck me immediately that there were so many on Christmas. Like, did they not have better things to do? Like, let people sit. It's Christmas. And yeah, I handed off my keys to my son and my best friend, asked for a jacket from the car, and I started recording and taking photographs. And I did at some point see one of the cops, or I heard one of the cops say, "Oh, they're recording," to one of the other ones, and a couple of them kind of turned around, which was also interesting. And then we're staying out of the way, we're staying back, we're not trying to get in anybody's way. This needed to be witnessed. This needed to be recounted for people who weren't there, because it really is an important issue. And the next thing I know, I'm being told I'm being arrested for trespassing. And if you locate the body cam footage, you can hear me say, "Are you serious right now?" Because I was absolutely shocked. Like, all I was doing was recording what was happening. And yeah, I think as I was coming down the hill, I can kind of see out of the corner of my eye or hear like what's happening. And that I knew that by the time I was getting in the paddy wagon, I knew that Matilda was as well. And it was so strange that we were both targeted first. And it's not like there weren't other people nearby. No, there were other people within the same kind of vicinity, but we were targeted.
Yeah, and so we were both put into the police wagon. The officer who took me down the hill actually thought about putting me in the correct gender side of the police wagon, but then thought differently and put me into the male side, which, you know, I'm a trans woman, so that's, you know, like, and he could have like, I had a press pass around my neck that said Matilda Bliss, and I had a driver's license in my pocket that said Matilda Bliss, gender F. At any point, you know, as police do, you could have looked in my pocket and found that I have a female gender marker on my license. So, you know, like, it was, and the body cam footage also shows a lot of really disparaging remarks. It's just imagining innately that I'm not telling the truth, which has been an aspect of all this, is that, you know, like, a lot of the things that we as trans and non-binary people face, like we're not who we say we are. That's been a major aspect of this from the very beginning. Anyway, so Veronica's process after like an hour in the van or something like that.
Yeah, I got out pretty quick. That's when I heard the thing that will probably, I'll never forget it. I'm one of the first two people being booked and processed out. And I saw one of the arresting officers go over to the magistrate with this paperwork, and he said, "She's saying she's press," talking to me. And the magistrate said, "Was she real press?" And I was like, in that moment, you decided who is and who isn't, which is a really important distinction, because silencing of the press is a very strategic move. And that's really what this boiled down to, in my opinion. And of course, the cop shook his head, and the magistrate could have decided apparently that we were pressed that night and actually said no and rejected the charges, and we could have been let go in that moment, but he decided we weren't, and we were charged.
Yeah, and I was actually the last to be pulled from the police wagon after 2.5 hours. And by that point, my wrists were very red. Thankfully, there wasn't any kind of nerve damage or anything, and I had a massive creak in my back and shoulders and legs. And I mean, a 6 foot tall person being shoved into the back of a police wagon, you can only imagine. But yeah, I got out around 2 or 3. It was a while ago at this point. Yeah, so that's how things went down on Christmas night 2 years ago.
And thank you so much for sharing your stories of that day. And unfortunately, this is obviously a issue you're still dealing with. Authorities prosecuted and continue to push charges against you. Could you talk about the legal saga that you have been through since that day?
Yeah, it's been quite the saga. So we had several continuances. So my phone was actually kept in police custody, along with my backpack of my phone, which I'd been using to correspond with other members of the Blade, to update on what was happening at the camp, to take pictures and pass them on, to interact with sources. All of that was being held. First, it was, I was just told that it was going to be in the property room. My editor and I go there as soon as it was open after the holidays, and they said, no, it's actually in evidence. And so, the district attorney needs to sign that out. And we go to the district attorney's office and try to get them to sign it out. They take my information. We found out more recently that there was actually a search warrant that was asked for and that was granted to search my phone. There's a lot of weird information on the incident log that maybe this, almost likely that this search was not actually about me. I mean, with a trespassing charge, that doesn't make much sense, and especially as a journalist too, that's so illegal. And so yeah, we're hearing that that the phone was possibly being searched, but not getting any actual documents related to that. It took until this past Monday to actually get documentation that yes, it was searched or attempted to be searched. And so yeah, it got to be finally in April that we had our bench trial. And that's one person deciding whether or not we're guilty or not guilty. This person, one of the things that we've been pretty proud about and critical in our coverage is the police department. And we've backed various community demands pretty explicitly. We actually stand with these communities that want the police department defunded. And the judge actually in a press interview at one point said that that defunding the police was the craziest thing he'd heard. And in the case, actually, or in our bench trial, he had heard from the police and the prosecution that yes, we were journalists. Nobody tried to deny that, but when it came time for the judge to deliver his verdict, he said that no evidence had been presented that we were journalists. So that was really alarming. And Veronica was actually over sentenced. We were offered a prayer for judgment continue, which is the lightest sentence you can get, where as long as you don't get convicted for a year or have charges in a year or something like that, like you don't have to, it goes off your record, I guess, but it doesn't really either. But anyway, like, we're not into that. We're into appealing. Veronica, talk about your sentence.
Yes, so I like that you mentioned the whole prayer for justice and the disappearing, because at some point while the judge was reading all the paperwork, my lawyer handed this paper to me that had my record on it. And there were so many things that were just like dismissed, dismissed. But I was like, see, that's why nothing disappears ever. It never goes away. It's always there. They're always going to access it and they're always going to use it. And while Matilda got a $25 fine, did you get unsupervised probation or just the fine?
I didn't, fine and court costs for me.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Like,
yeah. And meanwhile, I got 10 days in jail, suspended sentence and 1 year of supervised probation. And I think I got the court costs and the fine as well. And I was in shock. And I knew too in that moment that like we had looked at the paperwork for like minimum and maximum sentencing. And very easily that judge could have said, we had 1 day time served because we'd been arrested and booked and all that stuff. The judge could have very easily said, time served, 1 day, you're done, just get out of here. We still would have appealed logically. But no, he wanted to make sure that I knew how he felt. And I'm aware.
Which isn't even like permissible and like NC sentencing guidelines for a trespassing charge. But yeah, so yeah, as I said, like just this week, found out that my phone had been at least attempted to be entered. We've also started speaking publicly about park bans that were put on us without any notice, without any kind of conviction. Obviously, they were, backdate. They were, I don't know when they were officially. I guess they were probably put into place on Christmas, but they were for a whole year. We were never notified. The police actually sent me mail saying that I could pick up my property and had perfect chance to say, by the way, you're banned from public parks for a year, and did not mention that. So we've started to speak up on that, but it's just been like it's been one thing after another. Wouldn't say this is the extent of what police can do to reporters, but it's pretty far towards that.
Well, thank you again for sharing your story and everything you've been through and continue to go through. And maybe we have a couple minutes before we might open it up to audience questions. Maybe if, I could ask Seth, when a reporter is being mistreated by law enforcement or having a negative experience with law enforcement, what type of resources are available to them?
Well, one thing I would note is that there are several organizations out there that do provide legal support for free to journalists. So don't think that just because you don't work for an organization with an in-house legal department and a huge legal budget that you're out of luck when it comes to getting a lawyer. You can contact, for example, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, especially when it comes to search and seizure type of issues, your local ACLU chapter. We're not a legal services organization. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not practicing law in my capacity with Freedom of the Press Foundation. But if you want to reach out to us, I'm happy to try to put you in touch with the right people. So that's one thing that's important to know. I think there are different situations you're in as a journalist. You're going to cover a protest where you have reasonable cause to anticipate that there might be a run-in with police. You've got to try to prepare yourself. And that doesn't mean that the journalist here or any other journalist did anything wrong. Like the onus should be on the cops to not arrest journalists for no reason, not on journalists to compromise their work to avoid getting arrested. But given this reality, there are things you can do to prepare. So say you have documents or recordings with source identities, you might want to leave them behind if you can, if you have reason to think you might have a run-in with the police. use secure communications technologies, Signal, for example, so police can't read your messages if they seize your phone, like what happened to Matilda. Back up your phone. Use a throwaway phone if you need to. It all sort of depends on the situation that you're in and what you can reasonably anticipate. When it comes to a situation where you might be accused of trespassing, know your rights. Generally, sure, reporters, like everyone else, are subject to the law, but the government is required to make reasonable accommodations, essentially, for reporters so that they can observe police or government in action. So there can be reasonable, what's called time, place, and manner restrictions on where reporters can go, but they need to allow an avenue to report. As Matilda and Veronica mentioned, in their case, they were told to leave the park. Well, if they left the park, it was the middle of the night, it was pitch black, they would have been, I think 150 yards away and down a hill. They couldn't have seen a thing. So recognize that, and if police ask you to back away, you can ask them, well, where can I go where I can still observe the story? So, and even if it's late at night, if the police are going to wait until a park's closing time in order to make news, in order to conduct an encampment sweep, yeah, you should have a right to observe that. That's not unreasonable. Now, of course, just because cops aren't permitted to do something doesn't mean they won't. So you've got to use your judgment and decide what risk you want to take. Veronica and Matilda decided not to back down and to risk being arrested, and that's commendable, but not everyone's going to make that choice, especially in volatile situations where officers are using force. So if you decide to leave, at least you can record what's happening and report what was done to you. In Dion's situation, he wasn't comfortable getting into the van and closing the door. He made that clear to the police, and I mean, who knows what would have happened if he hadn't. So know your rights. When it comes to recording, different states have different laws in place when it comes to recording police. Some require you to stand back a certain number of feet to give police room to operate. So it's good to be aware of that. It's good to be aware of your state's reporter's privilege law. Of course, you've got the right to counsel and demand a lawyer if you're questioned by police. One thing we recommend is to write your lawyers, or if you don't have a lawyer, your legal services hotline, your editor's number, so on your arm or your hand, so that if your phone is seized and you can't access your contacts, you still know who to call. Unfortunately, we've recently seen some prosecutors trying to criminalize that practice and argue that having your lawyer's number is evidence of intent to commit a crime, but that's ridiculous. And we still recommend that that people do that people do have their lawyers' numbers. Aside from, we and several other organizations conduct trainings on digital security and other things that journalists can do to protect themselves. And you're welcome to reach out to us on our website, or reach out to me directly. My email is on the website, and we can connect you with people who do that. There are plenty of resources available, both from our organization and others. And, the last thing I would say, this isn't so much for the journalists who are being arrested, but for the press at large. Write about this stuff when it happens. Make a scene, make some noise. Dion said that journalists don't like to make themselves the story, and there are good reasons for that. But this is a real threat, not just to journalists, but to the public. It's not just about the journalists, it's about the public who's deprived of information, and they want to know that. It is a real news story. And it's not only a real news story when the reporter comes from the Wall Street Journal or from a national news publication. If the prosecutors in Veronica and Matilda's case end up setting a legal precedent that journalists can't cover news at public parks in plain sight at nighttime, that precedent is going to apply to you, whether you work for the Asheville Blade or whether you work for the New York Times. Just like if the government is successful in prosecuting Assange, that's going to apply not just to Julian Assange, but to everyone who engages in similar news gathering, who obtains and prints classified information from government sources. So the advantage the press has, the weapon that the press has that others don't, is that they're the press, the power of their platform, and the best thing we can do is use it.
Thank you so much, Seth, and for sharing all of those resources. We've dropped links in the chat for everyone to review, and happy to follow up with anyone who who might want to get the full list or a refresher. And partially to your notes, Seth, I was curious. One commonality between the stories here is that parts of the encounters were caught on video, and I'm wondering, both with Matilda and Veronica, and for Dion, whether you think the aftermath of these situations would have gone differently if you didn't have that video footage as you told your story. And maybe Matilda and Veronica, if we could start with you.
Yeah, having what we had from that night definitely helped when we were ready to publicize some of those images and short video. Definitely brought a good amount of attention to what we were facing, and just the issue in general. So yeah, it's indispensable. And interestingly, the thing that directly followed our arrest was police dragging people out of tents on Christmas. So and yeah, if anybody in the more general public is able to see reporters getting arrested, obviously, yes, like within your own personal capacity, please get that on video, because that is, we're now starting to see the national level attention that this deserves, but it's been a while, to really get there. And so yeah, please always film the police, within your own capacity.
Yeah, I want to echo what Matilda said. Always film the police. Always film. You never know what is going to be useful. I don't think we were. I know we got stuff that night before we got arrested. That was very important. But also, to echo Matilda, we found out later about people being pulled out of tents, like on the ground, pulled along the ground out of these tents. And I wonder if that could have been different if they knew someone was watching, if there was actual accountability for what they were doing. I think that's really what they were trying to avoid by making sure we weren't there anymore. They don't want to be accountable for their behavior.
If you look at the body cam footage, as soon as other people who could have filmed what was happening up there had left and gone down the hill, that was when they turned to us. So, everything was synchronized in a way to make sure that nobody could capture what was happening after we were arrested.
Thank you. And Dion, the video footage that the bystander was able to capture in your case was also really compelling. And could you talk about the importance of that as you kind of told your story and interacted with these different agencies?
Sure. Yeah. Can you guys hear me? I just had some technical difficulties. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I think that the video was really key in making clear what exactly had happened, because I think had there not been a video, there probably would have been a back and forth of, oh, well, this reporter says this, the police say that, it makes total sense. And I think there is a general, I don't know if we want to call it bias, but a general sense by the public that when the police say something, that they're telling the truth. So I think had the police had the opportunity to come out and say, we didn't detain this guy, or he did X, Y, and Z, or, he was being resistant, or, all these other things, then that account likely would have been believed. And I think that would have been the end of it. I also think when you see the video, it's very clear what's happening, that I'm there, I'm not causing a problem, I'm not menacing, I'm not creating a threat. There's no reason for this officer to be putting me in handcuffs and taking me to his car. And I think the video just makes very clear exactly what happened. And it's one of those things where it's kind of an unassailable account. You can't say there was a good reason for this to happen, because then you're basically asking people not to believe their lying eyes. So I think that was a big part of this in terms of the coverage that it got. And I also genuinely really believe that video, that person recording, helped keep me safe. who knows what would have happened if that person hadn't been recording, if there hadn't been a public record of this happening in real time. That's one thing that I think of. And you can see on the body cam video, when the woman shows up and she asks, is it all right if I record? I'm like, yes, please record, because there was real fear that if you don't record, if you aren't tracking this, if there's not some kind of live real-time accountability, I don't believe my safety and my life are going to be protected. So a number of different reasons for really valuing that person who took the time to start recording and to share that video.
Absolutely. Maybe we have a couple of audience questions, but before we get to them, I was just wondering if we could go around and each of you could share what would you most like others to take away from your stories? It might be, you might have already mentioned it, but if you want to highlight, what really is what you would like people most to take away from what you've gone through and to think about. Maybe if we could start with Matilda and Veronica and then go back to Dion.
Yeah, a lot of it's been mentioned. Like, I like that Seth, said, like, none of us have done anything wrong, but it can be worth it to be ready to know kind of everything that police departments and prosecutors could throw at you potentially, and to have a plan to get through that. If you are still able to news gather and you've been given, a different place to film, then, that's something that I think that, I'm not going to tell anybody, like, don't consider that, do whatever you need to do for yourself, also for the news. I think I don't want to jump too much, but have a good password protection on your phone. I liked everything that Seth said. Not that I didn't have a good password protection, but these departments, when they take your phone into custody, they can make copies of it. They can take their time to try to get into it. Obviously be ready just in case to be able to call a lawyer or like even jail support. Like, there's plenty of like jail support setups in various cities that if you're able to use that, just be ready is basically what I have to add.
Yeah, I also wanted to echo one of the things that Seth had said about how important this is for all journalism in this country, because they will use this case, whether you work for the New York Times or a tiny publication in your local community. They're going to use this in the future. It's incredibly dangerous how this moves forward, because the press and journalism is how people get what they have, because you're not able to be everywhere at once, and it's just really frustrating. What Matilda was saying, that it was a while before anybody really started paying attention. But I'm sorry, I'm good thinking about that, and it just made me really frustrated. And of course, a couple times I've talked about this. I always want to recognize my privilege in being able to fight this, because there are a lot of people who can't, people who need to move on with their lives. There's so much of our prison population, our jail population, is just people who had to give up. They said, I can't do this anymore. I have to be able to move on with my life. So this is a privilege to be able to carry this on, to carry this fight on, because of how important it is. And there are far too many people incarcerated that do not have that privilege.
Yeah, I would just follow that up. I agree with all of that and say, I think it's also very important that, regardless of where you work, that we as journalists do take this obligation to report seriously. And when things happen to us, I had people here at the Journal tell me, you should probably just drop it. You shouldn't try to make a thing of it. You don't want to report that. That's just going to create more problems. And I think it's really important that we push back against it. I got a lot of support from the journal, really from day one, even before the video came out, before they'd seen anything. I told them what happened, and they came out and they supported me. And, you know, like I said, our editor-in-chief sent a statement, our chief legal officer, our managing editor, like everyone was really in my corner in a very important way that I think gave me the support to move forward and, you know, talk to other folks in the press. And obviously this was a story, it became a big story in a lot of different places in the press. I think had I worked at a different place, I think of my last employer, Axios, which was a very racist and toxic environment. And I don't know that I would have had the same kind of support at a place like that I got here at the Journal. So I think it is important that regardless of where you work or how you feel like people at the top of that organization are going to respond, that you let this be known and put the word out in whatever way you can. And it's not guaranteed that it's going to get a lot of attention, but, you know, like we've seen with Matilda and Veronica, this case is starting to pick up some steam and some momentum. And I think it's very important that people know about this and know what's happening and follow their case. Because like they just said, this is important. This affects all of us, and not just us as journalists, but folks, you know, throughout the country.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you for sharing your stories and you know, sharing the commonalities there. Seth, did you have any thoughts along those lines on your part?
I think I would just echo what others have said. You know, be prepared. Don't assume that just because there are laws in place to protect you, that the authorities are necessarily going to follow them. Be as prepared as you reasonably can be. Be aware of the climate towards the press in the United States right now. I mean, people might have seen, like in Oklahoma a couple of weeks ago, a sheriff's office and other officials were literally caught on tape plotting to murder journalists, and that's something that they thought they could do openly among their peers. So in a lot of the country, that's the attitude towards the press, and it's something that journalists need to be cognizant of and deal with. And again, I would just repeat that the one tool that journalists have that no one else does is their platform, and that's something that should be utilized whenever possible to make sure that the public is aware of these issues and aware that it's about more than one journalist, you know, charged with trespassing. It's about press and speech rights for all of us.
Steve, you are muted.
Thank you so much. Well, I thank you all so much for sharing your stories, your insights, your reflections. As each of you said, it's important for all of us to join together and speak out when there's an abuse of press freedom, and this was, I believe, such an important part of that. So we packed so much information into this hour. We know these issues are more prevalent than we'd like, and your experience, your expertise will help us better understand how we might approach these difficult situations. And so thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for sharing your stories and your insights, and we will look forward to sharing the video soon, along with a survey and additional resources. So thanks to all our panelists and our participants, and we'll look forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.